what I want to speak about is a specific memoir, type of memoir, produced by people who have Huntington's disease or who care for people with Huntington's disease. As was announced in the opening remarks, it's often described as the cruelest disease in the world for plenty of reasons. For those of you who have not already looked up the rather frightening Wikipedia entry, Wikipedia being the source of all information now. It manifests usually towards the late 30s, early 40s, by which time you have already had children, usually, under routine circumstances. It's genetically transmitted, and if you have the mutation, and there's a certain number of counts of the alleles which manifests as Huntington's, if you have 40 or less repetitions of that allele, you are not at risk. But 40 and above, you have a 50% chance. So 50% chance of the disease manifesting itself. If one parent has it, that's enough. Now, the point of the disease is it manifests after you have had children, which means if you have inherited the disease, the chance that you have passed it on to your children is also 50%, which is why it's often called the cruelest disease in the world, because if people knew they were likely to have this disease, they may not have children, but you usually discover this much later. Till the 1990s, there was no genetic test for detecting Huntington's disease. Now we have a genetic testing mechanism. Huntington's disease was discovered in 1890s by a man called George Huntington. And it was originally called Huntington's chorea, C-H-O-R-E-A, because chorea meaning dance in Greek, primarily because of the spastic movements that the disease sufferers exhibit, contortions, twisting of their arms and limbs. There's another reason why it's called the cruelest disease in the world. It lasts for 25 years before it finally kills you. And so you die progressively slowly. There comes a stage where your involuntary reactions also stop, and you forget how to swallow. And that's how eventually you die. So people who get Huntington's disease are prone to depression, and the largest number of suicides among any disease sufferers is from Huntington's disease, primarily because it lasts so long and there is no reversing of the condition. Some medications will slow down the process, but nothing stops it. It's irreversible. And the third reason why it's often called the cruelest disease in the world is sometimes entire families suffer from it. So the memoirs I am looking at invariably have people writing about their parent, sibling, near relatives who have had Huntington's disease and died from it. There are people among whose family members, nearly 50% have died of this. From their siblings, 4 out of 5 have died of Huntington's disease. It's not very common in India. It's for reasons we do not quite know. But like I said, it's genetically transmitted. In what I want to talk about, I'm going to look at 4 or 5 memoirs by Teresa Crucher-Marin, who looks after somebody with Huntington's disease, Mona Gable, whose brother dies of it, Deborah Goodman, whose 2 brothers had Huntington's disease. One killed himself. The other dies eventually of this, and she herself carries it. Jean Barema, a very well-known French journalist, magazine editor, who believed he had Huntington's disease because his brother had it, but eventually tests negative. There is Stephen Beatty, whose memoir, In Between Years, Life After a Positive Huntington's Disease Test. He has a blog. He still writes on the blog. He's still able to write. Is about living with HD, as the disease is usually acronymized. Also, Sarah Foster in Me and HD, which also is about how you deal with it. And I have a couple of things to say, primarily about the narrative form that these disease sufferers, patients take to. And I want to speak about these narrative features as a variation of the Bildungsroman. All of us know what a Bildungsroman is, I assume. Bildungsroman is a narrative of growing up, and it will conclude with the person, and the 18th century English novel genre is full of these examples. The person grows up and integrates into society, discovers a family, discovers an identity, acquires property. There cannot be English novels which don't deal with property. Either the property is land or wives, as we know. So the Bildungsroman is a narrative of growing up, and the progression is from early youth, sometimes childhood, all the way to integration with society as an adult and the discovery of an identity. Well, my question when I began looking at Huntington's disease memoirs, and it's part of a collection of things I'm doing with Huntington's disease itself. So one of the requests I'm making is that please do not, I've put it out on the email to Dr. Bindu Nayar also, that the talk shouldn't be made public, but it's part of a forthcoming publication as well. The question that troubled me was, there are studies of Czechs that deal with growing up. What about the obverse? What about narratives of growing old? Especially growing old with a very specific kind of aging, where you will anticipate not just senescence, the technical term for old age, but a Huntington's disease senescence. It's related to also the work I'm doing with Alzheimer's disease, and that's why they go together for me. That is, the HD memoir anticipates a certain mode of aging, a certain portent of the future, which affects their present. How does the memoir, the biography of such a person, progress? What are its key features? So I'll first look at senescence. Stephen Beatty asks, quote, "How could I cope with the knowledge that, unless a sufficient treatment came along soon, this disease was going to kill me in the not too distant future?" This is Stephen Beatty in between years, life after a positive Huntington's disease test. In Beatty's quote, his anxiety, as you can see, is about coping with the knowledge of HD, which is imminent. Just as aging is imminent and death is imminent, HD, if you have the gene, is imminent. There is no power on earth, no medication, no treatment that will stop it from appearing at some point in your aging process. So his anxiety is about coping with the knowledge of HD, which translates into knowledge about his aging process. And that's why literary gerontology, the writing of this knowledge of aging, of a certain kind of aging. I'm not talking aging in the generic sense. I'm speaking about HD aging, all right? HD, by the way, is the acronym for Huntington's disease, not high definition. For those who are brought up on contemporary digital technology, HD can mean only one thing. No, that's not what I'm implying. HD is, in this particular talk, at least Huntington's disease. There are two components to knowledge about HD and the literary gerontology that is emerging from such knowing. One is what I'm calling affective knowing. The other is genomic knowing. Affective knowing. First, Stephen Beatty writes, quote, "I inherited the gene mutation from my father. Its first arrival into my known genealogical tree was my paternal grandmother. I can only remember her being ill and living in a psychiatric hospital. In my mind, I can visualize her all scrunched up, sitting in a chair and not interacting with anyone." And he will later say, perhaps you have similar memories of a grandparent. He lists how two of his uncles also had HD, and then about his own father. So like I said, the entire family, his grandparent, his father, and his two uncles. Beatty writes about his father. He observed how there were changes in his personality, deconditioning in his muscles, weight loss. Then he describes his sister, one of whom turned out to be positive and the other negative. Sarah Foster, after discovering that she's HD positive, recalls her mother's battles with Huntington's disease, the involuntary movements. Like I said, there are spastic movements, the paranoia and other symptoms. Her father, who noticed the symptoms, had refused to admit that he had noticed these symptoms. Deborah Goodman also remembers her father's first symptoms. I am defining affective knowledge as situated knowledge, situated within what could be thought of as the affective and intimate circle of the family. And it emerges in the context of care. Care is a form of knowing, argues Maria Puig de la Velasca, in her book on care. She calls it affectionate knowing and the caring dimensions of knowing. Caring politics is what she calls practices of knowing will effect a transformation of matters of fact into matters of care. So care produces a certain knowledge. In Deborah Goodman's Hummingbird, which is her memoir about Huntington's disease, she talks about how her mother plans the future. Her two sons both have HD, and she starts making plans. Quote, Mom started to make plans for her son's future by arranging funding for his care and trying to find the best care home that she could do for him. But she was just going through the motions because she knew that Nigel had other plans. Nigel, one of her brothers who has HD, had decided he will commit suicide rather than be confined to a home. Goodman's narrative is about the burden of such a knowledge, the affectionate knowledge. How does one deal with this knowledge? As Goodman puts it, I couldn't disagree with his decision, but I was sad. So very, very sad. How does one deal with this? Stephen Beatty will, after discovering he has HD, will start thinking, I have passed it on to my children, and my sons each have a 50% chance, I quote, each have a 50% chance of inheriting this damn disease. And he writes, the years when we watch and care for other Huntington's disease affected loved ones and wonder, how long until it is our turn? This is fungibility, the prospect of replacing somebody with ourselves, substituting oneself with another. So all these people who have Huntington's disease are alert to two things, that they have inherited it from parents and they have also passed it on. So in Goodman's case, like in all HD memoirs, the circuit of knowledge is structured around a specific condition of aging, how their near and dear ones had lived long enough to die of HD-related problems. Every memoirist that I'm aware of, and there are about a dozen in existence, which I am aware of. Other languages I don't know, I'm looking at English language text only. Every memoirist records recalling family members whose increasingly bizarre behavior now has a name, HD. The HD person's knowledge is a retrospective recognition of her or his parent and his or her sibling has suffered from. This is what I'm referring to as affective knowing. In the sense, it is above all else proximate and intimate knowing, even if the true biomedical knowledge of the sickness is not available. Affective knowledge is related to a particular kind of aging in the family. It may be partial, it may be misleading, it may be concealed. For example, medical records of some people are not revealed, and for a very long time, people don't know that what their grandparent died of was actually HD. Because as you know, psychiatric disorders have a huge stigma attached to them and people do not talk about it, even within families. So in several cases, people discover that their parents or their relatives never mentioned that their family actually carried the gene for HD. Affective knowledge of one's family comes as an analeptic narrative segment in these texts. As the memoirs describe these cases from their family's past, the narrator, now re-examining the lives of grandparents, parents, and other family members, is forced to face up to the fact of HD. And this is what haunts them. So Goodman's mother, having dealt with her husband's HD, only hopes that there will be a cure before her children are affected. She has already discovered that two of her sons, like I said, are destined to develop HD. Teresa Cruce-Marin, who is now a very well-known activist in the field of HD support system, observes the reactions of people to the sight of her sister-in-law, Marcia, who has HD. Marin writes, quote, you don't see many Huntington's patients because they're so difficult to manage. That's how they become isolated. As I began working in hospice, my fears and demons calmed. Interacting with the dying, working with compassionate colleagues, being reminded daily how precious life is, and assisting patients with the end-of-life issues our society ignores so well, I felt I was being given just what I needed then. Emphasis here. Knowledge for the future needs of my two dying sisters-in-law and possibly of my husband. I quote again. Knowledge for the future needs of my two dying sisters-in-law and possibly of my husband. Cruce-Marin aligns professional knowledge stemming from her care role in the hospice with the future of her care role in the lives of her marital family. Affective knowledge is a means of uncovering their own fears and anxieties around their imminent future condition. But it is also about piecing together a self that is more than about just having AD. The second form of knowledge, as I am referring to here, is genomic knowledge, which is the research, the data, the biomedical tests, the diagnostic tests that come after a whole process of investigation. The agonizing over genomic knowledge, which is obtained via testing, like I said, is a standard component of the HD memoir. Since HD is most often a late onset disease, genomic knowledge presents a definitive map of aging, which is why my interest in the Bildungsroman, which is a map of growing up. So genomic knowledge, excuse me, presents a definitive map of aging for the individuals and the family, depending on whether they do carry the defective gene or not. The genomic knowledge is intertwined with the family's history, recently discovered and analytically recorded. Analepsis is the opposite of prolepsis. Prolepsis is flash forward. Analepsis is flashback, recall. Teresa Crucher-Marin, on hearing of a genetic test being finally made available, the HD test was finally invented around 96, 97. Okay? Knowing was the key, she says, because only then could a plan be devised. Her partner, John, whose family has HD, is more skeptical, and he asks, what if I tested positive? I'm afraid it would destroy us. Jean Barrema wonders, what good would it do to know? At this point, I want to make a small digression. Since the test was invented in the mid-90s, there has been a huge debate among people whether they should go in for this test or not. As in, do they want to know that they will get HD? What good is that knowledge? Since it's irreversible and imminent, won't it spoil the rest of your present by seeing your future in a certain way? That is, the test and the test reports, the diagnostic report, is future directed, and the more you know, the less you enjoy today and the current life that you have it. The other side of it is, of course, you can plan for your future. And one of the leading writers on the subject, Alice Wexler, Wexler, and Nancy Wexler, two sisters, their mother died of HD, and they were the people, along with their father, who's a physician, and George Church. George Church is a geneticist at Harvard. They funded the search for the Huntington's disease gene. And they were the people, that was the team that finally invented the genetic test, found the gene and invented the test. Wexler has a book, The Woman Who Walked into the Sea, which is a history of Huntington's disease. And she has another memoir in which the debate, the memoir is called Mapping Fate. Her concern is, what good does it do to learn in advance? And much of the debate about this test is about, do you need to know and do you want to know? So that's a trajectory I want to keep as a kind of backdrop to what I have to say. So in the process of knowledge being acquired, an alternative perception of one's lineage also emerges. Offering an alternative genealogy, the HD memoir presents what Tim Ingold describes as a narrative interweaving of past and present lives, while retracing the lines of past lives as we proceed on our own. Genetic markers, the percentage of risk, the demographics of HD patients, comparative statistics constitute genomic knowledge. That the HD test would confirm an aging process or a certain kind of aging process, which is informed by HD, is a fact that memoirists are aware of. Some, like I said, refuse to know with a degree of certainty whether they will age with HG or not. After he's possessed of this knowledge, Jean Barrema writes, then I'll have to deal with my demons. And I have to deal with my brother and sister who both have HD. His genomic knowledge begins to shade into his affective knowledge, imbued with the fear of his own aging process, and that will take on the same qualities as that of his sibling. When the scientist tells him, doesn't matter if you have it, just live well, Barrema thinks to himself, quote, to live well, I have to block them out, my brother and my younger sister, block them out, and that horrific beast that is eating away at them, and that I fear may come and eat me as well. Hence, the disavowal of the fact that the genetic lottery had determined his siblings' lives, senescence, and eventual death, but not his, because when he eventually does the test, he tests negative. And that is what enables him to even consider a good life. In other texts, the knowledge gleaned from the observations of their loved ones or themselves is supplemented by the knowledge from science. So once the textbook material is made available, the blood work is made available, genetic test diagnostics are made available, it contributes a certain kind of self. As I've quoted before in a talk on neurochemical cells, I want to invoke something here from Stephen Cohn, who argues that in the brain scans of people with mental health issues, the scan is a material representation of what they are. The scans are representations and modes of explaining their selves, their symptoms, and conditions. They make it real. So the biological data, the genetic data, is part of what they are. And it elaborates a new self to revise their old one. So the scan and the diagnostic reports constitute a self. Goodman concludes by stating that this textbook explains the changing behavior of people with HD. Susan Lawrence, who also has HD, advises all HD subjects that the neuropsychological assessment is one of the best pieces of forensic evidence that link you to your disease. Do not lose this information, she writes. So affective and genomic knowing are constitutive of HD self, its relations, and the perception of itself. Together, they also form the locus for a future-directed interpretation of life, one that takes the form of narrative foreclosure and a performative prolepsis. Narrative foreclosure is when, I quote Mark Freeman here, people who had gathered the conviction that the stories of their lives were essentially over, having internalized cultural narratives of decline. So, in the case of the HD memoir, narrative foreclosure is the assumption that one day this narrative will culminate in HD, because HD is the termination of all narration. In contrast to the Bildungsroman that climaxes with the creation of a self integrated into the social order, this kind of narrative concludes, or sometimes even before it concludes, with the alienation from the family and the social order. In the HD memoir, the narrative construction of future identity is of possible selves. Fritz de Lang defines possible selves as future representations of the self that are hoped for or feared. In this case, in the HD memoir, the possible self is an aged self that requires at best a rudimentary narrative with a minimum of laborious imagination. So Nigel, who has been diagnosed with HD and his symptoms have started, tells his mother, quote, "I will get worse and worse, and eventually I won't be able to do anything for myself. I will have years for this." Somebody else comments, Sarah Foster, about her possible self. It's only going to get worse. I imagine how much worse the people she loves will feel when she declines. And she says, "I don't want to hate or be hated by my relatives." This is their possible selves. It's a very limited set of possible selves once the symptoms set in. Progressive deterioration that will produce tantrums and distemper, frightening spastic movements, inability to focus, among a range of illnesses. Like I said, if you look up the HD entry on Wikipedia, it will frighten the devil into you. The narrative foreclosure in the HD memoir has to do with the minimal options to construct any possible self, the story of their lives without a restorying. There, in Barema's words, his narrative plot of the future can be summarized as slow, unbearable, unlivable. I quote again, slow, unbearable, unlivable. That is the future narrative. So the narrative ends with HD coming. HD will come. It's not the uncertainty of the future, but the certainty of this future that drives the narrative. Wayne Booth, the theorist of fiction, argued once that human rights is the right to choose one narrative out of the plot of our lives. The freedom to choose a plot out of the drama that is our lives. In this case, there is no choice. The genetic test proves it. The diagnostic report tells you And narrative foreclosure is the recognition that there will be no other kind of story to tell, only a slow, unbearable, unlivable life. I now want to move to the last part of my talk on senescence as performative prolapses. Prolapses, like I said, is flash forward. If you look at novels, there will be these comments that they never met again. They never met again is prolapses, looking forward, and it anticipates how the narrative will go. The theorist of aging, Anne Davis Bastine, has argued that, quote, through writing, people with dementia have the choice to reveal their illness rather than have their illness reveal them. Let me read that again for you. Through writing, people with dementia have the choice to reveal their illness rather than have their illness reveal them. The idea of revealing one's illness is really about sharing the knowledge and information about one's condition with the world. It's a form of written admission about their future and the form of aging that they can expect. I've elsewhere argued that the HD self, incipient, dormant, but always already a part of the self, because it's in your genes, you see. There is no question of avoiding that because it is already a part of yourself. So there is no other possible self that is possible, shall we say. So I've elsewhere argued that the HD self, incipient, dormant, but always already part of self, presents what I've called a prospective teleology in these narratives. It's in a forthcoming essay. In the HD memoir, the narrative event is directed at the eventual and imminent appearance of HD symptoms, which is a narrated event. So I'm distinguishing between the narrative event, which is the event of narration, and the narrated event, which is the event about which the narration is being done. It anticipates that the life described in narrative will arrive finally at the expression of the disease itself. The HD and its symptoms, progress and climax, death, slow death, is the teleology of the narrated event. The prospective teleology praises the narrative event, the onset, as the inevitable endpoint of both the individual and the embedded context in which she or he lives. The HD memoir is more often than not structured around a narratological prolapsus. The Oxford English Dictionary defines prolapsus as the action or fact of representing or regarding something in the future as already done or existing. The traditional prolapsus is a narrative device calculated to generate suspense, especially by withholding vital information. The familial, medical, and social practices prolaptively link the present to the future in the HD memoir. Stephen Beatty advises everyone diagnosed with the HD gene to put their papers and finances in order. The discovery of the HD gene in one sibling, writes Mona Gable in her memoir Blood Brother, split us, that is her family, into two camps, those who favor testing and those who didn't. Family behavior, attitudes, and practices are proleptically linked to their recognition of a certain kind of past and with the HD future. Later, Gable will write, I quote, knowing I might have HD felt like the opposite of when I was pregnant, when the secret I was carrying inside me was life, and I wanted everyone in the world to know. This secret was dark and scary, a monster threatening to swallow me whole. Invoking a comparison with pregnancy as a secret, Gable proleptically aligns her past, her present, which is marked by her knowledge, with an HD future. Rather than a future which will produce and bring forth a life, she expects it will produce HD for herself and for others in the family. In another instance, the question of testing is itself aligned to the future of her kids. We talked about the predictive value of the test, and she asked, that is the counselor, if I mostly wanted to take it because of my children or if I had any other concerns. No, I told her, only because of my kids. When moments such as testing and familial discussions intensify the proleptic narrative of the individuals and families, other moments trouble the prolapses by offering a counter narrative, also directed at the future. What are these counter narratives? These are horrific descriptions. Should we give feeding tube options once they are unable to swallow? Hospitalization. Will they opt for soft restraints or hard restraints? As in, what do you have to say about being chained to your bed or chair? Preparation of a will. How should feeding be done? Should there be modes of keeping you alive? These are things that people like Sarah Foster have to put together. So Foster, I'm suggesting, intensifies the proleptic narrative. She writes down instructions, plans, and conditions for our aging process and the HD senescence. The intensification of prolepsis is in sharp contrast to the traditional definitions of the trope. In the HD memoir, time as a linear progression of events is replaced by time as coexistence, where HD is already present in the body, where HD is already built into the genetic material of the narrator, and aging is a process of the manifestation of what is already here. The anticipation then is borne out by the certainty of the future, a condition characteristic of prolepsis, where the anticipation of future events in a fiction counts as prolepsis only when that anticipation turns out to be true. Narratological prolepsis can only exist in fictional worlds is one argument, because the future to which it refers can only have existence in a fictional work, in a fictional world. The recording of a future moment in the aging process where HD will appear represents the event before it appears and thereby produces the event in the form of a narrative. That is, when you write about a future HD, HD appears as an event even before it appears in the daily material reality of your lives. And thereby the event is produced in the form of a narrative even when the event is not produced in the form of your body. So the HD memoir, by speaking of the HD within, even when not visible yet, produces the subject as an HD subject in the act of documenting the genetic material. The narrative does not follow the event, it produces the event. It is in the representation of the genetic data today that the event of HD is always already produced and recorded, even when it is not yet here. Hence, here is prolepsis as a present that is already the future. The narrative of the testing for the HD gene when belonging to a family with a history of HD is a performative prolepsis, which, I quote Mark Curry here, takes an excursion into the future to envisage an event which produces the present in such a way that the envisaged future actually comes about. Often described as a self-fulfilling prophecy, a performative prolepsis involves an imagined future which produces the event and a present which thus produces the future. So, when a person first self-identifies as a likely HD subject in future, and second, documents the testing process, he or she performs the future senescence. The present is reconstructed as an HD present, because the gene is already inside you. The future HD, that is always already present in you, and it is revealed by testing. And that is what will produce a particular kind of aging tomorrow. There are two modes within and moods within performative prolepsis. The first is the fear that inflects the protension. That one day I will have this. One day my nightmares will come true. One day, as Sarah Foster will put it, my dreams for the future are unrealistic and will not come true. They will anticipate what it is likely to be. Deborah Goodman will write, each visit to the hospital brought my fears to the surface, as I was reminded of my potential fate. The feeling I tried to push as far down into my boots, an ocean of sadness and fears. That sadness became a part of my natural state and stayed with me for many, many years. Any clumsy movement would trigger an instant panic within me. Was this a normal gesture? Or was it a sign of the onset of HD? What happens is because, and this is one of the moods or modes of performative prolepsis, they begin to see everything in themselves as a sign of the arrival of HD. While the dominant mood, this is the dominant mood, but there's one other, and that is a mood of hope. Many of these people enroll in drug trials, experimental trials for new tests, new medication, as something that I want to elaborate on. That is, people who have been diagnosed with HD enroll in clinical trials at major research laboratories, university laboratories, scientific organizations, as a way of contributing to the knowledge of that particular condition. So when Mona Gable visits a UCLA laboratory where HD stem cells research is being undertaken, she's overwhelmed. And she writes, was I seeing the holy grail for Huntington's and possibly low-grade Higgs disease and Parkinson's too? For Sarah Foster, being a part of drug trials is crucial because that way she believes that even though she has been gripped by HD, she is doing something. By becoming experimental subjects and thereby becoming enmeshed in a new biosocial network and participating in a project that is likely to be a part of our aging process, this is a performative prolepsis built around hope rather than just built around fear. The memoir's hopeful portentions approximate to a narrative longing about a certain kind of aging, if not for themselves, at least for their children in the future. The HD memoir's evaluation of the future and the potential of HD research unsettles the performative prolepsis that is governed by the fear of the future, hopelessness, and a certain death, even though the scientists and doctors caution the memoirist that the cure is still very, very far away. I want to now conclude with a couple of points about responsibility and fungibility. In the traditional Bildungsroman, there is a free individual who becomes a citizen, one who perceives the social norms as one's own. One internalizes them and adapts them. In the kind of memoir that I'm looking at, with alienation rather than integration, how does the HD subject anticipate a full responsibility? An HD personhood is an expression of what Nicholas Rose terms genetic responsibility. Adapting the work of Carlos Novas, Nicholas Rose speaks of multiple domains in which genetic responsibility plays out: the making of a molecular genetic identity, ethical problematization, a new relation to expertise, and finally the formation of life strategies. The memoir I'm looking at foregrounds genetic responsibility, life strategies, an attempt to retain a nominal or symbolic identity to the extent that HD allows. Granted that community and societal identities will diminish as the disease progresses. You don't go out, nobody wants to visit you. It's impossible to socialize because your symptoms are terrible, but you do not abandon the hope. The theme of responsibility is cast as fungibility. Indeed, the HD subject's memoir is a fungibility narrative. Every HD protagonist is already subject to inherited conditions. First it was my grandmother, then it's me. After me, it will be my children. That is fungibility. Their individuality is erased in favor of an identity such as the HD patient only. You recall. And somebody, Susan Lawrence writes, I began to get a taste of what my mother went through. My mother eventually became the caregiver for my grandmother who had Huntington's disease. Then her mother gets it, then she will. So Lawrence's mother, she records, is afraid of her mother, the grandmother, and it's a terrible story. The grandmother was sent away to a home because nobody could take care of her any longer when the Huntington's disease became serious. In the home, she was abused, raped, and eventually she died alone. So Lawrence's mother is afraid that she will also one day be sent away. I quote, she's afraid that she too will be sent away to die. My mother does not want to be sent away. So this is the fungibility. And Sarah Foster wonders, after me, will it be my children? Krucha Marin's memoir of her husband's family, it's called Watching Them Dance. She devotes considerable space to wondering if her husband is next in line, and if so, will it be their children? Aging is almost entirely defined by and in the possibility of symptoms appearing at some point in their lives. But the fungibility narrative of genealogy evacuates the aging individual of anything other than imminent HD. Despite the narrative foreclosure and the emptying of their lives, it's possible to see the insistence on participation in trials and experiments as fulfilling a genetic responsibility, which is a future anterior for the time when, with aging, HD will certainly manifest. The protagonists will replace with themselves their siblings and parents with HD, those who suffered and died painful deaths. To be fungible is also to be open to new chances, events, and possibilities for self-creation. So Nigel plans his suicide. Goodman herself takes to studying and practicing strange healing techniques. Krucha Marin becomes an advocate activist for HD. The genre, even in the face of dwindling social and individual identities, we find the HD subject positing and constructing in howsoever minimal a fashion a personhood. We see in the HD memoirs the biological, more specifically genetic, and the biographical conflicting, and cooperating in order to present a sense of the HD self. The HD memoir strives to balance the hopelessness that is brought on by the disease, a particular inevitability of this kind of aging, and the reconstruction of a self retrieved from this inevitability. Aging, although determined in many ways by the onset of HD or the anticipation of HD, is not reducible to it. Thank you.